What's up? It's your boy D Change coming at ya with another one. Daily Dave. So today I wanted to talk about Chinese as a language. My notes here say uh, dialects, written versus spoken, vernacular, slang, also related to the broader idea of regionality rather than monolith. I guess the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because there was this Twitter conversation that prompted this train of thought, and it was like someone I followed responded to someone else's tweet that said, what language do y'all want to learn or are currently learning? For me, it's Mandarin Chinese, and so this one person I was following it has like Cantonese speaking parents, so similar to me, and they said, I'm currently taking classes, but at some point I would like to learn Mandarin, which I don't speak at all. And so the follow up to that is a stranger was like, hey, is there any mutual intelligibility between Cantonese and Mandarin? And I know this because uh, I definitely wouldn't call myself a native speaker of Cantonese, but the irony is that I think, if anything, I spoke Cantonese before I spoke English. It's just that after a certain age, all I spoke was English. So it's very clear that I am a native slash fluent speaker of English rather than Cantonese. To this day, I'm still more comfortable in Cantonese than say Mandarin, and in some cases Japanese. But that's only because it's like I'm still more, I'm still surrounded by it, like by native speakers of it. But unfortunately, I don't get to actively practice it and stuff like that. So, and that's because my parents speak English fluently. So, but yeah, so I know that there really isn't much mutual intelligibility between the two. The thing about the Chinese like languages, and that's the thing, there isn't just one Chinese, right? Is that they covered a lot of regions and a lot of people, and they were very distinct in their own rights. So this will get into, like, I don't know, a broader history lesson maybe another time, or just like a crash course of it. But yeah, like this person responded, no, not really, the sounds and tones are different, although you do have some words that are similar or the same. For example, friend is 朋友. So like it's like a very slight difference. I feel like I almost feel like I can't even hear the difference. I think most people, if they were to hear it, they wouldn't be able to hear it. So like in Mandarin, I think the standard way to pronounce it is 朋友, and then like in Cantonese it's 朋友. Like there's a difference in tone. But I think if you were to try to say it, someone would kind of be like, ah, yeah, I know what you're talking about. So yeah, with the tones or the way, so, like, was it although you have some similar words, with the tones or the way it's pronounced being slightly different, I can't understand at all when someone is speaking in Mandarin. So the same person replies, that's interesting. I assume that speakers could switch with variable degrees. I guess I'm going to start reading about both of them on Wikipedia now. Original poster, OP says, most Canto speakers know Mando because that's what they used in school, and I think a lot of Mando speakers understand some Canto because of Hong Kong films. What's cool is sometimes in movies, one person will speak in Canto, the other responds in Mando, and they'll have an entire convo like that. And then another person came in and said, that's true for the spoken language, but when written, they're essentially identical. So they are mutually intelligible in that medium. I'm sure you know this, just clarifying for readers of this thread. So that's when I came in, and I was like, I was leaning more towards your statement originally, but a brief look at Wikipedia leads me to believe it's less mutually intelligible than originally thought. And then I linked the article for written Cantonese on Wikipedia. And the reason why I brought this up is because it kind of the long story short, it's more born from Hong Kong, and there's like, I guess in a way, there's certain like characters like this one right here that only exist in spoken Cantonese but doesn't exist in, say, like standard Chinese written language. So I guess part of this is I have to make the distinction, right? So I think if you're a native English speaker, most of the time you're going to think of spoken English and written English as pretty close, right? I think when you learn it, there's a very clear difference between what would you call it? There's a very clear difference between spoken English and written English, in the sense that written English is almost always more formal, perhaps always more formal. Meanwhile, spoken English can range between formal speech to, slang. I think vernacular is the word you would use for like common speech, right? Let's see if that is the case. Vernacular, because otherwise I would say colloquial or something like that, right? Vernacular, the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people, yeah, in a particular country or region. So like a standard American English vernacular, right, might have contractions. It might have like kind of shortcuts in some of the words, whereas if you were to write it down, you're not supposed to include that technically, right? I feel like with the advent of the internet, this has become less of a thing, or less of an issue, so to speak. I mean, it's an issue for older people, that's for sure. So I can understand why there's a lot of friction in this realm. I used to be a hard line like traditionalist slash like, like grammar rules and very pedantic about language, because in a way it's like, why have language rules, right? Because to follow them. But I also understand that language is very organic, and it changes over time. That's the thing, right? That's why we develop slang. If you've ever tried, if you're like my age and you try to watch Twitch streams or like TikToks or just anything that like teenagers are really into right now, you probably don't understand half of what they're saying, and that's because in a way they're making up language to apply to whatever they're the meaning they're trying to convey. And every generation prior to a younger generation will complain about that. They're gonna freak out about it. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the kids are doing this. Remember when rock and roll was a sin, and like then it became hip hop, and like I guess there's the whole talk about ebonics, which I think is now officially classified as African American standard vernacular. And so that's the thing. There's like this it's really interesting because American Standard English technically comes from broadcast English, right? So like majority LA, maybe New York type of like a media empire. But if you meet like a typical New Yorker, their accent is totally different from someone from Southern California. And then that's different from someone from Texas, different from Louisiana, the Deep South, and even like the Midwest, up in Minnesota, closer to Canada. Sorry, you start getting that the melding. I was gonna say molding. No, that's like a younger person term now, right? But like you kind of get this you get this fluid like mixing of the way languages work. So that's to set the stage here. The United States is actually a really good parallel for China. So in China itself, the standard dialect is Mandarin, and I believe it's like 1.1 billion native speakers of it, as in like they're born into that language. And the rest of the people in China, like they might take up Mandarin as their second language, and then there's a lot of like different native dialects that they might adhere to. Cantonese comes from southern China, and specifically the standard version of Cantonese comes from Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong province. And most of the time you'll know of Cantonese because of Hong Kong films. So I just wanted to set that stage. I think I've gone, it's almost been 10 minutes, and I now already feel like I can see how difficult this video would be, because now I'm like, I've got all these tabs open and I'm like, I'm not ready for a video essay. I did not prepare for that. So I came up with that kind of comment, that rebuttal of like, I don't know if they're mutually intelligible, dude. And the person responded with, the differences are not very large, mostly just little substitutions. I can confirm as a speaker of Mandarin but not Cantonese that I can read everything in that article and almost everything in Hong Kong. Parentheses, I learned on the mainland, so I'm less familiar with traditional, but that's a different issue. So I said, okay, this probably explains why my parents will read Chinese text, but I'm not 100% on if they're saying the exact same words. It's quite the contrast from being raised in the US, where written, spoken English seem much closer. And they said, yep, definitely a huge gap between written and spoken in Chinese, because it's not a phonetic language like most Western ones. To make matters worse, there are zillions of regional dialects. That is, I've lived in Shanghai for many years, but still can't understand Shanghainese. And then there was someone else who responded to me just to say, nope, they're the same. But then in Cantonese, it's in traditional, and in Mandarin, it's not. And that's kind of, I mean, that's a really simplified way of putting it. Like, yes, that generally you'll be okay with that. But to be fair, if you were to run into someone who's from Taiwan, they would speak Taiwanese Mandarin, which has a different name in Chinese, and then they would write it in traditional. And then if you were to, with Cantonese, if you run into someone that's more mainland influenced, they'll probably write it in simplified. If you run into someone who's from Hong Kong or diaspora, who chooses to keep traditional, that's why there's this huge problem. And the reason why this happened is because there were a ton of people in China. There's always been a ton of people in China. I don't think people realize how many tons of people have been in China throughout all of history. Because there are many regions to that country, kingdom, historical land, whatever you want to call it, that over time has constantly like mixed in with each other, conquered each other, fought wars against each other, influenced by other countries, spread their influence out. So it's like, it's one of those like central hubs of like cultural expansion. And well, certain parts of that area would be very diverse and just filled with activity. So to think about, like, say Cantonese coming from basically the Pearl River Delta region, the kind of the birthplace of like, it's not even the birthplace of Southern Chinese people, damn it, because technically Southern Chinese people technically come from the Yangtze River, right? That's the southern river of the two. Is that even right? Because I know I keep getting this wrong. The Yellow River is the northern one, right? Yeah, that one's the one that empties out into like northern Shandong province. And then the Yangtze, I think it's supposed to be like Yangtze, yeah. Yeah, that one empties out to north of Shanghai. And Shanghai is technically considered one of the southern parts of China, which, to me doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's because Guangzhou and like that southern China area, to me, like that's the coast of China, the southern coast, the southeastern coast, basically the area that faces Hong Kong, that has Macau in the backyard, and is kind of close to like Taiwan and stuff like that, right? But like in a way, historically, southern China has always been like the land south of, Nanjing is like the southern capital, literally. So we're talking the land south of like maybe Henan province or something like that. I'm trying, like, I don't think most people are gonna have a really good perspective of this, but I'm on like Google Maps, and like, so if you look at China like this, everything below where my mouse is southern China. And it's kind of wacky to think of it that way, but it's true. It's throughout history, that's how it's been kind of like what do you call it, referred to, right? So anyway, to summarize this, it just made me think of how like I said in my notes, like there's a lot of confusion behind this. I mean, it's just, let's bring up some microaggressions, right? I remember being in a coming to a gas station because my friend and I went to Las Vegas to go see Jay Chou perform. That was super cool. But on our way back, we had to go get gas, and so at some midpoint between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, I stopped the car at a gas station, walked in there, and the person at the counter was like, "Oh, like, you're not from around here, are you?" And I was like, "No, I'm from LA." And she was like, "No, but like, where are you really from? Where are your parents from?" I was like, she was like, "Where are you really from?" And I was like, "You mean where are my parents from?" And she was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "China." And she's like, "Oh, can you teach me some Chinese?" And like, I didn't have to do this, but I was kind of like, well, which one? Because the reality is, like, I actually know a little bit of both Cantonese and Mandarin in spoken form and written form, right? I don't really know like the specifics of written Cantonese because I haven't learned that way. The written Chinese I've learned has basically been Taiwanese Chinese back in Chinese school, which was like every Saturday, and all of us kids would rather like screw off and just go play basketball or play chess or whatever. And then in college, I was like much more serious about acquiring the language, and so I learned to write in traditional, and that was really good. That was actually like actually practical for expanding my vocabulary. But anyway, yeah. So I still am not like, I wouldn't be good at reading something in standard Chinese and then trying to like say it in Cantonese unless I just knew the actual meaning. And so in a way, that kind of brings up an interesting thought of like, what if you know how to write something, but you can't truly articulate it in spoken format the same way? And I think this is much more common in East Asian, maybe broader Asian languages, but I definitely see it in like the East Asian sense, right? And again, I feel like this has been alleviated, like there's been a bridging of the gap through the internet, because a lot of like Chinese, Japanese, Korean slang that I've somewhat been able to like interpret comes from like, you know, the act of shortening or contracting or just reinterpreting the language for a different purpose. So it's really interesting. But this is why I always have a tough time when someone like kind of just broadly goes, teach me Chinese. I mean, it's like, dang it. Because at least with English, I feel like, okay, there is a type of English everyone expects. And that's American Standard because of, you know, the cultural influence of the US and movies and stuff like that. To be fair, most of the time people are probably going to refer to Mandarin Chinese and standard written Chinese. And at this point in time in the world and politics and all that, it's going to be the Beijing dialect of Mandarin, and it's going to be the simplified script of standard Chinese. So in a way, I've kind of answered my own question, which is really ridiculous, but it's something I had to like think out loud. But it's also because like it's kind of because of multiple experiences I've had interacting with other people, even, you know, people of other like of other Asian descent. You know, they also may or may not understand like the interactions with historical China that their ancestors have had, their political leaders, etc. And it's just really, I don't know, it's just really interesting. Like to me, this is just like history porn and all that stuff. Like it's great. Like I love learning about how different cultures interacted with each other and how they influenced each other and how that led to political movements, how that led to changes in societies. But I also have to realize like not everyone is like a super geek like me, and so sometimes people just want like super practical stuff, and I'm like, I don't know what to give you, because let's be honest here, I don't know what exactly you're asking for. But maybe I can be better about that and just be like, why would this person ask me this question, right? Usually it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of like I don't want to say it's some sort of like circus show of like, oh, let me say ni hao and shit shay shay. I hate it when people say it that way. It's I don't get it. But it's also probably because of like all the god awful romanizations and spellings that like Chinese has had to like go through until something was standardized. This is the other thing. I don't think people have realized that like a lot of Asian countries have not like, they haven't had their full on modern sovereignty until much more recently. And so the establishment of like standards in language and society and politics and all that stuff is for the better part inventions of the 20th century. Or maybe they do understand, and that's why they're, you know, people are just like, oh man, Asia's so backwards, right? I'm just like, but that's also why a lot of commentators are saying like the 21st century is the century of Asia, right? Because now that a lot of them have had their chance to develop, now they're really ramping up, and I mean, there's gonna be a shit ton more people in Asia that can work and produce stuff. So once we get past this whole sickness thing, I can't believe I'm like referring to it that way now. It just seems, I don't know, I'm just really tired of kind of the more antagonistic discourse around geopolitics and kind of just, hey, what's all this, right? I'm just, right now at this current moment, I'm just really interested in telling you about Chinese, and I don't feel like I did a great job because We're past 20 minutes now, and I don't know if what I said even like makes sense, right? So long story short, Chinese as a language is a very broad term because there's spoken variants and there's written variants. The standard written variant is called Standard Chinese, and the most common version is the simplified script. Why was it simplified? For multiple reasons, political reasons, educational reasons, etc. It was harped as like an effort to increase literacy, and you know what, it worked because now China's like 90+% literate. So that result was like achieved. I might not be the biggest fan of the simplified script, but I think it accomplished its job. It's kind of it's there. More like older forms of Chinese, I do have to admit, have some crazy variations, and I think it wasn't fully standardized, probably because of regionality and the different dynasties, the different imperial the dynasties, basically the different imperial times, the different emperors, the different educational systems that were put into place. So there was, it's a never changing thing, and I think that's what I find so fascinating, is that China as like this nebulous thing, right? Has always been is a historical example of like what goes on in from an anthropology, I can't pronounce the word right now. From an anthropology standpoint, I don't know, like from like a study of like people standpoint, anthropological standpoint, China is super interesting because there is approximately 5,000 years worth of history to look at, and you can kind of see the progression of like ancient China to imperial China to modern China, and the difference in culture that comes about from that. And so because of stuff like that, you get like, I don't know, hundreds of variations of Chinese that are spoken by tons of people to this day. Now if you were to look at the stats, like 1.3 billion or 1.1 billion, I don't know, like over a billion people are born into speaking Mandarin. Cantonese is now at about 700 million, so it's nothing to, it's not, that is not exactly a small amount of people, but I can foresee that number shrinking, purely because Cantonese will unfortunately go out of use, as Chinese diaspora leave and go to more countries where arguably Asian languages aren't as favored. I think they're gonna lose their language, like, I mean, look at me, dude, like I barely speak Cantonese at all, and I would want that for my children, I would want that for my family and stuff like that. But it's tough, like we live in a different country where we're supposed to be speaking English or whatever, and that is, I don't know, it's not even like a supposed to be thing, right? California started off as a Spanish speaking territory, right? It used to be part of the Spanish Empire or the Mexican nation, and so I don't know, man. It's crazy, dude. That's the thing. That's what I love about history, right? It's that you can clearly build narratives out of like historical facts, but that doesn't change the fact that, like, I don't know, a lot of stuff happened, and I think it's a lot harder to. I think it's hard to oversimplify stuff like this, or like it's not fair to, really. I guess that's what I'm getting at. I don't know. I feel like I've rambled for way too long, and I just want you to know that Chinese is complicated. That's the takeaway here. No, but so yeah, like there's, okay, the thing I'll always tell people is like, all right, my family speaks Cantonese. That's popular in Hong Kong, Macau, and southern China, specifically Guangdong province and Guangzhou. It's part of the Yue family of languages. I think Cantonese is now considered the prestige dialect of Yue, as in like the most common and flagship language of this family of languages. And then there's PRC, People's Republic of China Mandarin, simplified script, Beijing dialect. So you got the I don't know how I can say it, like Beijing, like you have more of the noises and the curling of the tongue and the very, very like thick kind of feeling to the language. and then there's like Taiwanese Mandarin, which is in I forgot to call them by their names. PRC's Mandarin is 普通话, which means like, you know, common language. And then in Taiwanese, what? In in Taiwan, Taiwanese Mandarin is called 国语, which means country language. And I mean that's what they called it before, even before like they left China. But that's basically Mandarin, but with a Taiwanese like pronunciation scheme to it. And then Cantonese is in Mandarin called 广东话. But then the irony is that in Cantonese, at least for my family, we don't refer to it as like 广州话, which is how you would say it. We refer to it as 通话, which means, I always thought the 通, like for the longest time, I thought that meant like same, so like same language, same speech, and then like 同人 was like same person, and like 同人街 was like same person street, aka Chinatown. I found out like maybe a couple years ago that Tong is Tang for like Tang Dynasty, and that like blew my mind, because I guess if you think about it, and this is the historical context behind it, the Tang Dynasty was one of the times where the Chinese territory did finally extend like far into the south. And I'm thinking like northern Vietnam, you know. And that's another thing. Southern Chinese people probably have a lot in common with northern Vietnamese people. Like if anything, we've interacted with each other. We probably have common lineage and all that stuff, you know. If anything, the Southern Chinese were probably considered barbarians for the longest time until they were conquered by the Han Chinese or something like that, right? So that really blew my mind, because if anything, that meant like our connection to each other comes from one of the most prosperous times of like the empire. And it's specifically the Tang Dynasty, whereas like the Han Dynasty was the one that everyone kind of remembers as the great one after the first unification of China. So anyway, that's is a lot of stuff, a lot of crazy stuff. And yeah, it just makes me really want to like devour more about it, because it just, I don't know, it's like super cool to know and to learn. And growing up, you know, it just wasn't a priority for us to know stuff like that. And I'm just really, I don't know, I don't think it was something that my parents were super interested in telling us, because in a way it's like, you know, our kids gotta deal with life over here, you know. So I get it, man. I get it. It's hard. It's hard to be an immigrant. I tried it at one time, you know. I lived in Japan, you know. And then even as not an immigrant here, like sometimes there's issues I have to run into, right? So yeah, that's my I don't know. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk about Chinese as a language. I really hope I can flesh this out much better and present this in like a more educational video someday. I mean, you can totally go to YouTube and find this out right now. Like, if anything, I probably cited information from other videos as well. And yeah, I didn't even get to the part about like you're Chinese as a family and Cantonese people. Was that even a thing? I remember I was talking to someone in college. She was also a Cantonese speaker. She is. I think she still exists. And I remember saying like Cantonese people, something, something, something. And she's like, there isn't a Cantonese people. It's like, we're all Chinese. We speak Cantonese though. But the irony is I was looking it up, and sometimes people use that vernacular, like the Cantonese people, to refer to like us as like specifically Southern Chinese. It's kind of like if someone from Texas said, I'm a Texan over an American. Yeah, there's a lot of regional pride, you know, and for good reason. Like I feel like a lot of internationally famous Chinese people are of Cantonese origin or of Southern Chinese origin. So I can understand why there is that kind of, we need to delineate ourselves or whatever. So anyway, yeah, I've gone on way too long about this. I hope to make a better video about this someday. Or if you were curious and you wanted to learn more, I would be happy to talk to you, to talk with you about it. But anyway, that's just the random thing that I kind of thought of because of an interaction I had earlier this week. So yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. My name is David Chang, and I hope you have a great day. Yep, peace out, and I'll see you in the next one.